Let's just I guess generally what happened early morning U.S. time, which I think equated to like maybe afternoon, evening in Afghanistan. Two people who were later at least claimed by the Islamic State Khorasan affiliate that exists in Afghanistan claimed that they were of ISIS K and went and blew themselves up near the Kabul embassy, or not embassy, airport, and then at the gates of the Kabul airport, killing at least 60 Afghans and 13 U.S. soldiers. Again, this is as of the recording. I would expect with the numbers that have been giving in the number of injuries, that I think the U.S. was reporting in the double digits and then triple digits for Afghan civilians, that these numbers are going to continue to go up. The Biden administration came out and pretty quickly said that, hey, this attack doesn't have anything to do with the Taliban, and that they didn't allow this to happen, that they weren't behind it. And then the Taliban blamed ISIS-K, and ISIS-K came out and took responsibility. So Connor, fill in the rest of the details. What's going on here?
Yeah, so essentially we saw this. I mean, the withdrawal was going in the last few days. The Taliban had essentially announced that in fact the August 31st deadline, which was at this point, I guess, the third deadline as for the withdrawal. Originally, it was supposed to be May 1st. Biden pushed it to September 11th in late April, and then it was brought back to August 31st. But of course, at the beginning of August, the Taliban swept the country from the first provincial capital going down. 11 days later, Kabul fell, I believe, last Sunday. And so now we saw demands from the Europeans, as well as a lot of the hawks, for the U.S. to, it was a humiliating defeat, and that we needed to. Excuse me, I misspoke. It was this was the weekend before last. But since then, we've seen the Hawks come out in full force, saying this is a humiliation and that we need to, there's different things we can do. I think Paul Wolfowitz was out there saying we need to form some sort of an underground railroad, like a covert operations deal with the military, intelligence, coordinating with the military to get Afghans and other people out. And the Europeans, and like Boris Johnson, for instance, and the Wall Street Journal editorial board, everybody was demanding Biden needs to stay and blow past this deadline, particularly after the Taliban, once they got wind of all of this, because the withdrawal was going about as smoothly as it could under the circumstances, although it still was essentially a debacle. I mean, people were living in horrible conditions outside the airport. I mean, the pictures coming out were just horrendous. People, with trash all over the place and no bathrooms, and people getting dehydrated and handing over their children to soldiers, who then kind of use that for advantageous exploitative photo ops and different things for the military's purposes. But once the Taliban started saying, actually, no, we're going to hold you to this deadline, and it's a red line. If you don't leave by the 31st, you'll be viewed as invaders. It seems to me that there was a connection there, because then the airlift started becoming much more efficient. We started seeing, I think it was Monday was up to that point, the biggest airlift yet. And I think in 12 hours, they had gotten more than 10,000, or somewhere approximating like 11,000 people out of the country. And since then, we've seen, I think Blinken said yesterday that they've evacuated more than 82,000 people at this point. And they were discussing that between Tuesday and Wednesday, they had nearly 20,000 people evacuated on 90 U.S. military and coalition flights. So things were picking up, and Biden held strong, even though he was being pushed, like I said, in every direction to stay, which would have, of course, provoked a reaction on the part of the Taliban. So that was, a dangerous situation, but like we said, he held strong and did not cow to the war party, and so he told the G7 on Tuesday that no, I'm actually going to leave on the 31st. And so Boris Johnson, who was leading the charge, the British were the most pressed him the hardest. They announced that essentially they'd be done with their evacuation mission in the next 24 to 36 hours. They said that on Tuesday, and that they would have their troops out by Friday or Saturday. The Germans said they'd be done in a few days. The French said that they would be done today, actually, with their evacuation mission. So things look to be expediting. But then we saw this morning that there had been a major attack from ISIS, and like you said, the casualties are, we don't know them all exactly yet. But I think this was, I mean, you and I were speculating this morning before ISIS claimed credit for the attack. And actually, it was encouraging to see because it could have been some rogue Taliban guys. We thought maybe, taking a last act of revenge. But at the same time, I didn't think the leadership saw, I didn't think there was like an institutional incentive for them to provoke a reaction from the Americans, because it would of course be, if the Taliban really did do this attack, then that the Americans would have stayed, and there would have been, at that point,
Right.
it's anybody's guess exactly what would have happened.
There's just a lot of people in Afghanistan who hate the Americans, and the U.S. has carried out a lot of war crimes against the Taliban. So I think it was impossible that was just some rogue actors within the Taliban, or just Afghans, who knows, or even just somebody who's in Afghanistan who saw this as an opportunity. Connor, one thing I just wanted to hit on was that, and this is something that Will pointed out on the show earlier in the week, and I actually talked about in the last show, was that there had been State Department warnings, and actually they had talked about clearing certain areas outside of the Kabul airport, and I believe the U.S. and other Western partners advised their citizens not to go to these areas. And you can actually find in this CNN article where they talk about, be careful of the gates outside of the Kabul airport. So it seems like they had somewhat specific intel that this attack was either being planned or likely to happen, and somebody was unable to respond to it anyways. But it's pretty interesting what's going on here. So go ahead, pick up that.
Well, Sullivan, yeah, you're absolutely. I mean, Sullivan was coming out, Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, and was for days now has been saying that the primary threat is ISIS-K. It's a very real threat. They all said different variations of that phrase. I think even McKenzie said something to that, something approximating that today. We're doing everything we can, trying to find the exact quote. But anyway, he was saying basically that they're coordinating with the Taliban to essentially to prevent such to attend to this extremely, I think he said like extremely real threat or something like that.
Well, maybe this is one quick place to jump off and talk about something that I've been seeing, because people are suddenly all appalled that the U.S. would, for whatever reason, work with the Taliban against ISIS-K. This seems like, we're working with the enemy. Yeah. And how crazy this is. The Warhawks are absolutely in hysterics about it. And yet it's been going on for well over a year, and nobody seemed to care for most of the time when the U.S. was backing the Taliban with airstrikes against ISIS-K. I have this article here from the Washington Post from, I think it was 2020.
I think it was late last year. A group of Joint Special Operations Command were carrying out airstrikes, I think, in Kunar province in northeastern Afghanistan. And they had indirect, but pretty, it seems like, fruitful alliance with the Taliban. I mean, they even had a plaque at their headquarters called Taliban Air Force, or that said Taliban Air Force. And so I don't think they were, I think if I remember correctly, they weren't communicating directly, but it became obvious to the Taliban that when they would go in for these attacks on ISIS-K, there would be drones and missile strikes, airstrikes against these targets. And it got to the point where they expected it and they were happy to take the assistance, and they would move in once they saw the strikes occurring.
Yeah, this is from October of 2020. in the Washington Post. And so it's very interesting that you basically have all these people who kind of out themselves as Afghan novices by the fact that they're suddenly outraged that the U.S. would be working with the Taliban when it was obviously going on. And, far more, I think, far more in an optional way before, right? We didn't have to bat the Taliban with these airstrikes. In fact, you could also imagine a Pentagon strategy where they kind of say, Connor, well, these are enemies killing each other, and so let's just let them kill each other a little bit more. It doesn't seem like a bad deal, but, they specifically recognize that the Islamic State Khorasan faction was a worse group. One, I think, thing worth pointing out about this too, Connor, is what the Afghan ISIS faction it actually is and isn't, because there's a lot of people who seem very confused about this. There's a pretty good article by Anshul Levine today in Responsible Statecraft on it, but what I really have to recommend people read is the Afghan Analyst Network. It's I think Afghan-Analyst, and then the Islamic State in Khorasan, how it began and where it stands now in Nangarhar. And so this is, from 2016, and there's obviously been some things that have changed about ISIS-K since then. I think they've, obviously lost some territory as the U.S. bat the Taliban against them, but it's a fantastic overview of, where this group came from. And essentially, in the Obama administration, when they're really at the height of the drone war, they're carrying out a lot of drone strikes in Pakistan, and not only were they targeting people that maybe the Americans would think of as terrorists, but I think they're just helping the Pakistanis wage a war, a drone war, and a war in general, because they have forces on the ground against this Tehrik-e Taliban group that eventually flees over the border into Afghanistan. Now, there's some reporting from the time that I find pretty credible that the Afghan government, well, first of all, if you have refugees in your country, it may make sense that they receive government support. So that may be a part of this. But, as the Tehrik-e Taliban come into Afghanistan, they receive support from the Afghan government. And some of that support may have even come as they saw them as effective force against the Taliban. But for whatever reason, you have the Tehrik-e Taliban who end up settling in Nangarhar, Afghanistan, and then picking up the jihad fight and becoming the Islamic State Khorasan faction. Now, they haven't seemed in any way really resembling the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. They haven't set people on fire, as far as I could tell. Now, they have been more brutal than the Taliban. That's worth pointing out, that they have attacked targets like in Kabul, girls' schools, Hazara schools. I think early on, in 2017, there was an attack on a sports game. I think it was football, but soccer, but it may have been cricket. And the Taliban were like, oh no, we would never attack a sports game. This isn't something we do. And so in some ways, this was a group that was a little bit worse in hitting those soft civilian targets than the Taliban. And eventually they become a real problem for the Afghan government, and the U.S. raids special forces operations against them. But it seems like by 2020 they kind of decided that the best option was just to watch what the Taliban are doing in Nangarhar, and when they have the opportunity, blow up the ISIS-K guys for the Taliban. And that I think is more or less ISIS-K and why they had the relationship they do with the U.S. and with the Taliban. And so I actually named one of the last clips on the show, Connor. The Taliban are America's anti-ISIS force in Afghanistan, and that has more or less been how it's played out. And so right now you have a situation in Kabul where Taliban control everything in Afghanistan, I guess, except the Panjshir Valley and whatever ISIS-K, wherever they're holed up, is the territory that's not held by the Taliban in the Kabul airport. And so the U.S. has to coordinate with the Taliban. We know William Burns was in Afghanistan earlier in the week and actually met with Baradar. Not sure what they talked about. I believe there were even reports reports that the Taliban warned the U.S. About a possible Islamic State Khorasan attack, although it seems like a lot of people had read this red flag early on. Again, we see in the CNN article that they were fairly specific and fairly close to what actually happened in this attack. So, Connor, I'll let you pick it up from there, though.
Yeah, well, I mean, what's interesting is the hype of this is being used to sort of, it's interesting that this happened because for people who know that context, when you and I heard about this attack this morning, we assumed it was this group most likely. I mean, given the coordinated nature, and I was thinking like, well, whoever did this wants there to be some sort of a conflict likely between the U.S. and the Taliban because. And that's interesting that the Taliban had warned the U.S. Of course, they tried to warn the U.S. Notably about 9/11, sending their foreign minister months in advance after they were tipped off by an Uzbek jihadist sort of informant that they knew there was an impending attack on the U.S. There's no evidence that they knew the details, but they went to the American embassy in Peshawar, Pakistan, and the UN to warn the Americans of what may be coming, and. So yeah, I mean, and the Taliban they didn't want to, they're trying to consolidate control. They already, they have basically, like you said, everything except for the Panjshir Valley, and they've still got to deal with this ISIS Khorasan group. One of the things that we keep seeing in reports and from a lot of the hawks is they're conflating ISIS now, of course, with Al Qaeda, and they use those terms kind of interchangeably. And so they'll talk about how, well, when the Taliban was taking back these provinces and these provincial capitals, they would, free people from these prisons, a lot of Taliban prisoners in these prisons. And that could have been part of surrender deals and these sorts of things. But, the issue is, of course, there are ISIS members in those prisons as well. So that's being spun as that there's some kind of, alliance, John Bolton, and you see a lot of the hawks on Fox News and in mainstream media, they talk about it like these groups are allies, but of course, they're not. And so, it basically the line is that while the Taliban is you see this from a lot of the neocons, Bolton called it they're turning Afghanistan back into a privileged sanctuary for terrorists to attack America, to attack their allies and our friends. And actually, Dan Crenshaw, the congressman, was on Fox News today, and he was talking about how there was sort of a perverse sort of inversion of what's actually going on the ground, because the Fox News lady who was interviewing him goes, I guess she goes, and there's all these groups, and she goes, and they all seem to have a common interest in killing Americans. She goes, I guess when it comes to killing Americans, it's sort of the enemy of my enemy is my friend situation. And Crenshaw was just like, oh yeah, absolutely. And he was talking about we need to go back in and take the Kandahar airfield and take Bagram back. And they all keep saying this stuff. I sent you a couple videos of like Jocko Willink and what's his name, Marcus Littell, the guy who loaned survivors, based on all these sort of former military grifter types that keep going on and saying, we can do it, we can go back in. But I mean, it's just disgusting, because this is, we just had a new report from Cost of War come out that said that more than 240,000 people were killed in Afghanistan and Pakistan, like you were just talking about Obama's drone war, and terrorist sanctuary. ISIS is a result anyway of U.S. foreign policy, especially, Bush and Obama in Iraq and Syria. And this group is a result of the drone war in Pakistan. And of course, I think the Taliban has an interest in making sure, especially with their relationship with China and Russia, to ensure, because that's been the main concern of the Russians. The Chinese want them to clamp down on the East Turkestan Islamic group. What is it? The East Turkestan, is it the Front? East Turkestan Islamic Front? Anyway, that's the sort of the Uyghur terrorist group in I think it's Badakhshan province in the very northeast, sort of the panhandle area of Afghanistan that borders Xinjiang province of China and Tajikistan. And, the Russians' primary concern, they were doing drills a week or two ago with Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, preparing for, contingencies of, the conflict spilling over the northern borders there. And so the Taliban have want to make sure that these states know, these surrounding neighboring states are aware that they will not allow attacks to go, be launched from Afghan soil. And when the Americans were panicking after the fall of Kabul and they evacuated the embassy, and the Europeans were panicking, the Russians notably came out and said, "We don't see a reason to evacuate our embassy." And they said, "We think that we've looked at, the early impressions are that security will be much better under the Taliban than it was under the Ghani government." And so whoever was doing this attack, I think it was intended to put the Taliban in a very tough spot, where either the Americans would seek revenge, although it looks like, Biden came out and said he's not going to attack. Well, he said he's not going to extend the withdrawal, but he did say that we'll come back essentially and take retribution to the forces that attacked us today. And as Dave DeCamp pointed out on Twitter, they'll probably just bomb some godforsaken Afghan village to bits and then call it a day or something.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, the situation as it is, I think it'll be interesting to see where the Hawks take this. But I think things seem to be calming down because of the coordination between the U.S. and the Taliban. But that's absolutely true what you said, that is being used to sort of batter the American people and the Biden administration as being sort of weak and feckless. A lot of the early reactions we saw were people without evidence blaming this attack on the Taliban and saying, I guess this is a reasonable price to pay as far as the Biden administration is concerned, that we lose, that Americans are killed at the hands of the Taliban, or people saying Biden got played by the Taliban. But I think that coordination and Biden's steadfastness in wanting to end this war, or at least our intervention in it for the most part at this point, is what's preventing any kind of escalation, which I think whoever did this, of course, and the Hawks, who have common interests, wanted to see.
Yeah. So